All right. I think everyone has gotten pizza that was planning on getting pizza. If you want more pizza and we still have leftovers, feel free to get it. But as you probably have already seen, we've run out of plates. So we'll have to make do with our giant napkins. Before I start proper, I just wanted to do like a brief week in review, but less of a week and more like the first part of this week and like the end of last week. So just to kind of talk about what we did in Blue Team and also what we have done with CTFs and Cyber Range. So Jack, I'd like to speak, and Scott in a moment, you'll have to say something too.
So this past Monday, we went over home labbing, and I went over my home lab setup, and I was trying to relate that to networking and Blue Team security in general. And next week, this upcoming Monday, we're going to go over networking more in depth, and that will relate to, you didn't have to go to that one, but if you went to that talk and you were confused about some stuff, then this upcoming talk on Monday will be a little bit more clear. So attend.
And as for CTFs and Cyber Range today, so last weekend we had Insomniac teaser CTF. There were a lot of interesting challenges and a lot that we could not solve. So after today's GBM in Cyber Range, we'll be going over some of those challenges. And we'll also be launching our in-house training platform so that you guys can practice doing CTF problems on your own time in a similar environment to an actual one. Yep.
Yeah, so the name of this topic is Hackers Toolbox, which is a really fancy, really fancy term. But we're really going to be looking at the equivalent of like taking out like a couple wrenches, a screwdriver, maybe looking at another box. Because the Hackers Toolbox is a pretty big thing. There's stuff that might be used in pen testing, maybe trying to attack a system, maybe an actual unethical hacker trying to get into a system that they might be using these kinds of tools. But there's also the whole other side of the coin with Blue Team stuff defending a system, which has its own set of tools and relevant applications that they might use. But before we get into it proper, I was curious just to see how relevant this type of talk might be for the people here today, because if everyone kind of knows things, we'll switch gears. But sort of, if you can do like a raise of hands of people that don't have like their own virtual machine, never set up a virtual machine, and haven't really used any sort of tools maybe related to penetration testing or are pretty inexperienced with Linux. So basically, if you consider yourself a beginner, or maybe even approaching a little bit past beginner, could you like raise your hand? No judgment, that's fine. Okay, that's pretty good. If you have your own VM and you kind of feel like, this stuff is kind of old hat for me, we do have sort of we could also like have a little like mini table of like intermediate to, I don't know if anyone's like, yes, I'm an expert, but if you're, if you feel pretty comfortable with this kind of stuff, we can have a separate table where we talk about something a little more in depth, because Jack can talk about containers if that's something that you might be interested in, or any other topic. So if you want to stick around for a more beginners lecture, well, talk, not really lecture, that's me. But if you want to hang out in a little corner, you can do that with Jack. That's up to you. Also, this talk is recorded. I forgot to do it last week, but this is recorded. So if there's some stuff you want to come back to, we should have that up on our GBM recordings channel on the Discord. But okay, so Hackers Toolbox. So the first thing I wanted to mention is a tool called Burp Suite. So there's a lot of different tools for many different niches in cybersecurity, but Burp Suite is particularly useful for testing of web applications. If you're an attacker and you're trying to see what kind of vulnerabilities there are, this is useful. If you're doing pen testing, this is useful to sort of send requests and see what kind of responses they get. It's also useful if you're just kind of testing your own web app. That's something that I found, but maybe it's not really meant for that. It's meant for security. But you can kind of, again, send requests, see what kind of responses you get based on the types of things you put in your requests. So there is a paid version and a free version. The paid version, of course, has options like saving a project and a vulnerability scanner, but there's still plenty of useful tools in the free version, which is what I've used in the past. And so some of like the tools that are I found useful and are often found useful are things like the intruder, which is, these all have like fancy one-word names. So the intruder lets you customize, like automate custom attacks against web apps, which basically means if you have something like a brute force password attack, you've got some sort of username password field and you don't really know the password, but you just want to try a whole slew of them. And doing that manually one by one is quite tedious and no one really wants to do that. So Burp Suite does let you use the intruder for things like that, where like you just want to automate an attack that you're going to do multiple times, maybe with different inputs, and see what the result of that is. And then the repeater, although intruder does let you repeat things, the repeater is a separate thing. The repeater is basically, you have an HTTP request and you send it and you get a response. And then maybe you change something else in this HTTP request. Maybe you change something in the header, maybe you change something in the URL, then you send that and then see their response. So it's good for a trial and error kind of approach. So you can just kind of see what kind of things might affect the response of a web app. So the decoder is useful if you have something that's encoded in some way. Maybe you have something in the URL that's like, I don't know, base 64 encoded. It can help you do that. It's not, world's best decoder tool, because again, it's sort of part of a bigger suite, but it is pretty useful for like quick things and also maybe trying to see what kind of encoding there might be. It also helps you encode things as well. So you can encode something, put it in the URL, see if it changes anything. And then another thing that's pretty useful, I think the thing that you end up coming back to a lot, depending on what you're doing, is the proxy, which just lets you intercept the raw traffic and keep track of HTTP history. So anytime you send some sort of request, you can keep track of, oh, these are the requests that I sent. You can also see the response. Here's a screenshot of me using my 3-month-old Burp Suite app, where I just you can put a specific site as like your scope. So you can, instead of getting, because if you had like a bunch of things open and you have Burp Suite on, you can kind of just get everything at once, but you might just be interested in one website or maybe just one page. So I just put the UFSIT website there, and then just get request, just open various pages. So you could see that you can see like the request, you can see the response. There's plenty of stuff in the headers that you can check out. If I scroll down in the response, I would just see sort of like the HTML of the page. So some things you could already see just by doing like inspect source on a page. But if you're doing something like maybe posting to a form and you're changing sort of data, this Burp Suite is a lot more useful than just maybe messing around with like the source code using F12 or something. So that's Burp Suite. So it's useful for web app vulnerability research. Does anyone have any questions? I'll just be like asking each time, and it's okay if you don't. But yeah. So another tool that is commonly used is Wireshark. Most of the tools I'm discussing are pretty pen testing, like leaning in that direction, because that's mostly that's what I know more than anything. But Wireshark is also useful if you're sort of on the more blue team side of things, just because it just lets you have a sort of deep look at what's happening on a network, because you just kind of see, it's what's called a network protocol analyzer. You get a live capture of packets for different network protocols. And what all that means is that a network is like, you've got all sorts of like mail being sent in all different types of envelopes being sent to many different types of mailboxes. And so Wireshark lets you just look, oh, what mail is being sent? What kind of envelope? So is it a TCP thing? Is it a UDP? Is it some sort of HTTP request again? You can look at that and then see, where is that coming from? Where is it going? What's in here? Which makes it seem like, wow, you can find all this data through Wireshark. There's plenty of ways to protect data from just being like spit out on Wireshark, but generally if something's misconfigured or someone's not doing things securely, you can peek into TCP streams and see, ooh, this is the kind of information they're sending. And again, you could look at HTTP kind of communication to see what's being sent. From a more like defense perspective, you can see sort of unexpected activity happening in your network. You should be expecting certain IP addresses, certain ports being active, and then maybe you look at Wireshark and you're like, what is this IP address? Why is it trying to send me information? So that's also useful because you want to keep track of who's trying to interact with you and where are they coming from. So I didn't mention this with Burp Suite, but both Burp Suite and Wireshark are something that you can get like on your own machine, but it also comes with the Linux distro Kali Linux, which I'll get into a little bit when we talk about setting up a VM. But basically, it's a virtual machine that has a lot of this kind of penetration testing applications built into it. That's why it's pretty popular amongst cybersecurity people. So a little bit I'll talk about, this isn't a specific tool and more of a subset of tools that are used for disassembling and decompiling code. So this is just to name a few: Binary Ninja, Ghidra, and IDA. We'll actually be getting into reverse engineering a little bit more next week, but I just kind of wanted to briefly talk about what they are and what they're used for. If you have some sort of application, you can just run it, but you can't see its code. You don't know how it works. But if you're interested in that kind of stuff, seeing how it ticks, maybe trying to see if there's something you can break in there by seeing how it works. That's where reverse engineering tools are useful for, because you can take a program that's already compiled and decompile and disassemble it, which can break down this program into like basic assembly steps. And then also these tools will do their best sort of attempt. I mean, they're doing their best attempt to recreate the assembly, but then they'll also do their best attempt to recreate the source code. So like here, this is a screenshot from Dr. Wilson's malware reverse engineering course, because I don't have Ghidra on my own computer. But you see you have all these like assembly language kind of steps. And then on the side, you have what Ghidra has sort of believes to be the main function, and then what's in the main function. And if you're looking at it, you're like, this still kind of looks like nonsense, because the variable names are just variable one, and the function name is like function with like a bunch of numbers next to it. So they do their best chance of like recreating the source code, but of course they can't recreate things like variable names and function names, which is why these tools also help you like by letting you rename things and like bookmark things and make sure you can keep track of everything in this kind of giant mass of like decompiled, disassembled code. But we'll get into RE a little bit more next week. So this is kind of a broad thing to talk about, but the Linux terminal, and specifically why Linux, you may have asked yourself, I don't know if you have, but it's possible you may have asked yourself that why is Linux such a big deal in cybersecurity? Like, why is it that I come into like a cybersecurity space and like Linux is here? There's a lot of reasons why Linux is popular. But so one reason is that it's an open source operating system, which is not necessarily common for operating systems, which is useful because if you're trying to learn how operating systems work, what you can do with them, how you can maybe alter them, you can now like see the code of Linux. It's open source. So that's a big perk for people learning to work with the system and why it might break. There's also a large amount of tools that are useful for vulnerability research. They're on Linux. You can sort of call them from the terminal. They're built through Linux for Linux. And Linux is used in a lot of spaces. It's like a lot of the internet is sort of built on Linux. A lot of like network servers are built on Linux. There's plenty of appliances that have Linux as like the embedded OS. So it's in a lot of spaces. And even though things like Windows and Mac might be more used for like a user, like an employee in a company that might be using that, other things in the company might still be built on Linux. So it's important to know how it works and how it breaks. So, and one other thing that specifically the Linux terminal and also the Unix terminal is useful is scripting, because when you're opening up a terminal, you're basically opening up a window to a shell, which is like your sort of user interface with like the operating system. You can do commands to it. And the shell lets you both like execute commands. Like last week, we did bandit over the wire. We were just doing a bunch of commands. And it did things, it gave us the directories, we could search things in it. But these commands could also be used like within a program. So you can do scripts where basically you're writing a program with these commands and you can automate stuff like that. So you don't have to just manually do it. You can run these scripts, which is useful when you're doing much more like broad movement across a system than just being like ls, cd. Like you're doing a lot more stuff. You might be looking for something specific and getting certain information back. So also through the Linux terminal and also built into Kali is Metasploit, which is quite useful for penetration testing, but also very popular amongst the unethical hackers. So basically, Metasploit contains a lot of exploits and payloads that can be used to take advantage of or like discover system weaknesses. So basically, whenever like a version of something comes out and someone tracks down some sort of vulnerability and, oh, this is how I can exploit that, it ends up sort of in these like databases and repositories. And then we'll kind of end up on things like Metasploit, where you can use these exploits and sort of use them against machines that have these vulnerabilities. So that's a good thing for the quote unquote bad guys, and a good thing also for the good guys, because you can check what vulnerabilities exist for your machine. Check if a system is vulnerable to things like Metasploit. But for example, I just typed in VSFTPD, which is the very secure FTP daemon, checking if there's anything from Metasploit in it. So like in 2011, there was a vulnerability found in VSFTP, which basically let you get into the FTP server without authorization, which is not very secure. But so this backdoor is now on Metasploit, and you can use that in a payload to take advantage of that on a system that has this version. But of course, you can't just throw this on a machine. You still have to do some like previous reconnaissance. You have to be like, does this machine have this version of VSFTPD? What ports can I use? What's the IP address of this machine? To be fair, you might already know this information because you don't need a lot of stuff to use this payload, which is why it's very important to update and patch services so that they're not taken advantage of with things like Metasploit. But so now virtual machines, setting up a virtual machine. That's sort of what I've been leading up to, like the second half, I guess, of today's talk, which is first thing I'll say, why bother? So we talked about Kali Linux a lot, saying, oh, these tools are in Kali Linux. This tool is in Kali Linux, but why bother having a virtual machine in the first place? So the first reason, I guess in my opinion, is just you're able to play around with operating systems you don't have. It can be tricky getting things like a Mac VM on a Windows machine. You kind of like can't do it in any normal legal way. You can get like a sort of Mac, but for the most part, you tend to be able to get things like Linux, and if you're on a Windows machine, you can also get Windows. I think you can get Windows on a Mac too. I don't use Macs, so I'm not sure. But you can, for the most part, here we'll be talking about using Linux VMs, but you can still like add another like Windows machine on your Windows machine, and then maybe open up things there that you're not sure might just do something weird on your computer, but it might be safer to do it on a VM because you can sort of destroy that computer or like wipe it or go back to a previous snapshot, which I'll talk a little bit more. And that's safer than perhaps just trying things on your own computer. In the case of using Linux VMs, all those tools we talked about, you can use it. You can use like the Windows subsystem for Linux for doing these things as well, which is a great perk, but sometimes it's useful, again, to also be running in a VM, just because if you're doing some sort of like reverse engineering, if you're doing like malware reverse engineering or trying to like run something on your own, like without affecting your personal machine, it's a good thing to have. And also with things like Kali Linux, everything's already installed there. So you don't have to bother like looking up a whole slew of tools that you might need to use when a lot of it's already on Kali. And then so the thing I mentioned with snapshots, systems that let you use a VM will let you use snapshots. The one I'm going to be setting you guys up with does have snapshots, which basically says, you know, my VM's in the state. I want to try something, but I'm not sure if it's going to mess up my VM. So let me just like save the entire state of the VM and then try this thing. And if like, I don't know, it crashes and now the VM is just like broken, I can go back to the previous snapshot and things are okay again. So it's basically like a save state for your entire virtual machine, which is very useful. But as you'll definitely notice as I go through the VM setup, these things do take up space. So what I want to sort of walk through, there's different ways to set up a VM. I'm going to be using VMware. There's also VirtualBox, but I'm not very experienced with it. But the good thing about being UF students is that sometimes you get free licenses. Hooray! So there is a free license for VMware Workstation, I think 16.x Pro now, which I think is the newest one for Windows. And then if you're using a Mac, VMware Fusion 12 Pro is also available. I have a fancy QR code because the link is really long. But you could also probably look up VMware on the Hub UF, and it should also get you there. But yeah, so this part, we're like officially in a little bit more of a hands-on portion. If you don't want to set up a VM now, this is why we're recording it. But if you do, we'll be going through it. So let me know if you are doing it so I can keep pace with you. But yeah, raise your hand if you're setting up a VM. And if you're not, then I'll just go through this quickly and you can refer to it back later. Okay. Yeah, so you should probably get to a page like this. So I use a Windows machine, so I just got Workstation. You do need to sign in. I don't know if this is I don't remember if this is like an automatic account you get with UF, but if not, then you have to sort of set up an account. But then afterwards, you should be able to sort of add it to cart. It's free. And then once you finish the whole process, they should give you a serial number, which after you run the installer, they'll ask you for a license like code, and that'll be the code that you use. But yeah, we can do a brief pause for that to get set up because it's not like an instant thing. So we can just mingle. I'm gonna mute myself on Zoom and then we can come back in like a couple minutes and see where we've gotten. Okay, I'm not sure where everyone is at, but if you're setting up a VM now, I'm just gonna move forward. And let me know if you need to catch up. Okay, so once you've got the VMware like installed and you've set up like the license, the next part of it, now you've got VMware. The question is what operating system to choose from. There's a lot of different Linux distros. Again, you can get Windows, you can get Mac on Mac, if you want to have a second Mac on your Mac. But the two that we kind of were thinking about suggesting, so of course Kali Linux, because I mentioned has a lot of tools. But Ubuntu is also a good choice, because even though it doesn't come with all the tools built in, it's also good for just like kind of casually playing around. If you don't want to have like everything at once, Ubuntu is nice, because you can still get those tools on Ubuntu. You can just kind of pick and choose which ones you want. Whereas Kali will just have a bunch of things, but might be a little overwhelming since there's a lot of tools on it. But I'll give you sort of the option to go with either one of these. So there's different ways to kind of set up a VM. You can kind of already have a VM if there's already you can get VM files and use that to make a VM. But another way to get a VM, which is kind of usually the route I choose, is to get an ISO or ISO. So an ISO file or an ISO image, it's basically an archive file. It has a copy of data that you would probably find on an optical disk. And so a lot of the downloadable operating systems are distributed as this kind of image, because it's sort of a good way to sort of mount it on and just get this whole like slew of data of the operating system. So if you're interested in getting Kali, I mean, you could look up get Kali VM and it'll show up, but here's a link for Kali. And then for Ubuntu, you can just download Ubuntu. And then either one of these should give you this like .iso file. And that's what we're going to use to create the VM on the VMware program. So again, they're pretty big files. So if you don't have space in a particular drive, but you have space on another drive, do it in the drive that has space because they're pretty big and they'll take a little while to download. But yeah, so I'll give time for that as well. Yeah. All right, so while your ISO is downloading, or it might have already finished downloading, just wanted to mention actually creating a VM. If you're using VMware, there's like if you're using VMware on Windows, I just realized this isn't really a thing on the Mac, but there also should be like a create a virtual machine option. And so when you have your ISO, you can just press that button. It should ask for some sort of file. You want to put your ISO file in there. If you're doing Ubuntu, it should just give it to you like, oh, easy install, put in like some data about yourself and it should install it. If you're doing Kali, it might ask you some extra information, which is, there's a Kali on VMware guide, which if you went on the Kali website to get the ISO, there should be like a button that says documentation. It should send you to like the VMware document and it should give you the step-by-step process of setting that up. Might be a little bit different on Fusion, but it still should be pretty similar in terms of like the features that you're setting information for. But yeah, again, make sure that like any VM files you're putting are in an area that has space. because if you're going to do things like snapshots or just having a VM in general, you're basically putting another computer in your computer. It's not going to take as much space as a computer, but it'll still take up a lot of space. So don't put it in a tight spot because it'll grow. So be careful with that. But yeah, so at this point, you're just getting your ISO using like the create a VM button and kind of following the steps from there. Are there any questions on Zoom? Because I don't know if anyone's setting it up here or just kind of watching the step-by-step to see the process. But if anyone's stuck on anything on Zoom, let me know. I know that it's possible that you might need to request an account for on the hub, in which case it might take a little while to get VMware. But again, we're recording, so hooray. But yeah, I'm gonna go around here again to see if there's any questions. Yeah, so at this point, we're just doing a walk around, helping people setting up VMs. If you're setting up a VM at home, again, this next part is pretty straightforward, but I think I'm gonna end the recording now, just because I've sort of gone over everything, and if no one else has any questions, then that's pretty much it for the online portion. But yeah, thanks for sticking around.